Dr. James Blackwell, Korean War historian for the 307th Bombardment Group Association. In this 8th episode in our video chronicle of the 307th and the Korean War, we look at how the wing fought to the last shot fired, just moments before the combatants signed the armistice on July 27, 1953. I teach a graduate course on military strategy and the history of nations for the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. I challenge my students to a deeper understanding of how wars are fought and how they end. A discerning study of the history of military strategy leads you to two fundamentals, and this history of the 307th and the Korean War reveals just how these airmen recognized and applied those fundamentals. The first principle is that adaptation must accompany military strategy. All too often, we think we know what the enemy is thinking, only to learn later, sometimes tragically, that we were wrong. Of course, we must plan, analyze, calculate, and fight well, but doing so is insufficient. As the contemporary military historian Williamson Murray put it, constant change and adaptation must be the companions of grand strategy if it is to succeed. The second basic truth is, as Roger Spiller wrote, in every war, the aims of all sides, no matter how opposed at the beginning, gradually converge toward an agreement to stop fighting. Think about it. Whether it was the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, the end state was reached when the combatants talked face to face about terms and conditions. Only in biblical history does a war end with one side annihilating the other, or does a duel between champions determine which side is subdued? You see, war is as much in the cognitive domain as it is in the physical. Mission accomplishment goes to the side that adapts effectively and negotiates prudently. As retired General Marty Dempsey wrote, "No one more fervently looks to the end of a war than soldiers. All their exertions seek the day when the issues that sent them to war are settled and their objectives finally attained." 1953 is the year when the Korean War reached its negotiated end state. The 307th dropped the last bomb. The wing accomplished its mission no matter what pundits may claim about who won or lost the Korean War, and it certainly was not a forgotten war. The Soviets realized they had suffered a significant defeat at the end of November 1952. American B-29s had penetrated their dense air defenses and obliterated the airfields at Uiju and Sinuiju. As thousands of North Korean slaves of the communist regime set about repairing the runways, taxiways, and revetments, the Russians and their Chinese fellow travelers set about rebuilding their air defenses in North Korea with new equipment and new tactics. The engagements of late November provided the Russian MiG pilots and unified Russian, Chinese, North Korean anti-aircraft crews an operational environment for better employment of their new, longer-range radars and their more precise ground control intercept techniques. They also increased the number of heavy flak guns from 607 to 802 just in the month of January 1953, and went to 823 by the end of February, all concentrated along the approaches to the Yellow River airfields. This made the intelligence task of plotting the flak laydown for mission preparation even more critical. Their most significant improvement was in the employment of MiG-15 night fighters. By the end of November, the Soviets had 2 full squadrons manned by MiG-15 pilots now skilled in night fighting techniques. With almost 30 MiG-15 pilots now proficient at engaging B-29s after dark, they could stagger their alert status 3 hours ahead of the arrival of the B-29s at the target. This allowed the communists to maximize the time on station for at least a half dozen MiGs the entire time the bombers were most vulnerable, from their initial point to their departure point. In this photo, all 13 MiG-15 pilots of the 535th Regiment posed for a unit photo. The 535th was one of the 2 Soviet night fighter regiments patrolling MiG Alley in 1953. The new communist operational concept was put into action on the night of December 9, 1952, when they claimed to have shot down a 98th Bombardment Wing B-29 over Suiyo. Bombcom reported, Although 4 Red aircraft made 2 firing and 4 non-firing passes, the Communist intercept effort remained totally ineffective, and no damage was reported to United Nations aircraft. BombCom-2 had assessed the results of air combat at the end of 1952 and recognized that, quote, the enemy was only effective whenever he could illuminate its aircraft with his searchlights and work a fighter attack by visual means. Operating against a darkly painted aircraft reduced his capability because we are able to break a radar-controlled searchlight lock-on by use of chaff, and the enemy is unable to retain the painted aircraft in the searchlight by visual means, end quote. Every B-29 in the command now had its underside painted it black. Some extended it to include the rudder. The BombCom commander recommended to General LeMay that all SAC bombers be likewise lacquered. But the black paint was not enough to prevent the loss of one more B-29 from the 307th Bombardment Wing on the night of 10-11 January 1953. On Mission 495, enemy searchlights, up to 25 of them, locked on to aircraft number 44-061802 over the Anju marshalling yard. Weather aloft produced light contrails trailing behind 802, and searchlights were able to lock on visually. 3 MiG-15 night fighters moved in and shot it down. All 12 crewmen were able to bail out before it exploded in the air. The Soviet account adds detail. According to Soviet military archives, Deputy Political Commander of the 351st Fighter Regiment, Captain Ivan Golishevsky, was directed to the 307th B-29s via P-20 periscope radar. He approached from 6 o'clock high and fired at 650 to 700 meters until the B-29's flanks filled the range ring, after which he gave one long burst of fire. He broke off combat underneath the enemy aircraft, and after turning 180 degrees for a second attack, the pilot noticed that the aircraft he had attacked had caught fire and was descending in a steep bank to starboard. Golishevsky's squadron commander, Major Koltyashov, also scrambled and attacked the B-29 and saw his rounds hit and the bomber catch fire. Although Koltyashov lost sight of the bomber, another pilot from his squadron verified he saw it crash to the ground some 40 to 50 kilometers northeast of Anju. A third MiG-15, that of the 535th Regiment's senior pilot Yakya Z. Kabayev, was also credited with shooting down a third 307th B-29 that night. This is an artist's rendition of Kabayev's MiG-15 Beast serial number 759. The Soviets credited Kabayev with shooting down a 307th B-29 on 11 January and an RB-29 the next night. The 307th, in fact, lost only one B-29 on the 11 January mission. I find it interesting that in Soviet archives, the commander, the political officer, and the senior pilot were each credited with a kill on this mission by Soviet counting rules. The entire crew of 802 was taken prisoner. All except aircraft commander Captain Arthur Hayes were repatriated in Operation Big Switch in September 1953. Captain Hayes is still listed as missing in action. The pilot, First Lieutenant Samuel Massenberg, was special and accomplished, yet humble. Listen to Colonel Beck's remarkable account of reuniting with Lieutenant Massenberg 40 years later.
Well, the third mission, when we lost the third airplane, I was in the right seat that mission, and I was running the communications. We had the wing commander with us, riding as an observer, and I was talking to this one airplane, co-pilot on this one airplane that had been hit, and talking to them, following them as they came out of Korea, and it ended up they were in pretty bad shape, and they were going to abandon the aircraft. So everybody had bailed out, and the co-pilot said, you know, I've got to go. The aircraft commander's telling me to get out. I hope I see you. I said, well, I'll pray for you. Good luck and Godspeed. And that's the last I heard from him. Well, probably a year later, when they started the prisoner of war repatriation, I was reading the list, and I saw this guy's name. So I realized he had been captured and was a POW and was being repatriated. Well, I didn't think any more about it. And in 1993, I went back to Boeing Field in Seattle for the 50th anniversary of the first B-29 flight. And the 307th Bomb Wing, which I was with at that time, they were having a reunion, and I didn't realize that all that was going on before, but I did. When I got there, I found out they were having this reunion, and I met with a bunch of the guys, and we were in a room having drinks and talking, and in walks this pilot, this man, who happened to be a black man, and I remembered this co-pilot was one of the only black pilots in the wing at the time. This was in 1952. And you'd never see that in the Air Force today. But anyway, there would be many, many more. But he came in and we got to talking, and I realized who he was. And I introduced myself and told him the circumstances as I remembered them. And he says, "You were the last guy I talked to before I got captured." I said, "Yeah, that's exactly right." He says, "I remember the conversation well." And that was about the extent of it. We exchanged comments and so on. But that really was a moving experience to get to meet this guy that far long after the situation that occurred when we were over Korea.
Samuel E. Massenburg soloed at age 15 before he was licensed to drive a car. He learned how to fly at Neil Loving's Detroit Flying School. Loving, a double amputee, provided Massenburg with his inspiration to overcome any obstacle in flying. He went to college, but in November 1949 left Wayne State University to enter flight school in the Air Force, graduating to become one of the very few black bomber pilots in the military. He was assigned to a B-29 crew and arrived at Kadena in August 1952. In January 53, Massenburg was no rookie, but those unexpected contrails that appeared just as he approached the target gave the enemy night fighter a fateful chance at his B-29. When he hit the snow-packed ground in North Korea on January 11, 1953, he found his way to a hiding place in a cave, but was captured the next day. He was tightly bound and marched off to Camp 2, where Chinese interrogators took great interest in this rare find, tried to entice him to convert to communism, defect, and subvert the morale of other black POWs. He would have none of it. In a surreal parallel to his mentor Neil Loving, a Chinese doctor amputated Massenburg's ring finger and snipped off the end of his little finger. 6 months after repatriation and rehabilitation, Lieutenant Massenburg was back in the cockpit of a B-47 and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1969. But that's not the end of the story. After retirement from the Air Force, he earned his Ph.D. at Virginia Tech and became Dean of Men at Hampton University before returning to government service in 1980 at NASA Langley. He was Director of Education. At NASA, Dr. Massenburg soared to greater heights of accomplishment, creating first-of-its-kind research internships, HBCU programs. Plus, he initiated distance learning programs in aerospace science and engineering for K-12 students. His NASA award-winning Connect television broadcasts won 12 Emmy Awards. He retired from NASA in 2006 after receiving the Federal Distinguished Executive Award in 2002. Tail number 802 was the last B-29 lost to enemy fire in the Korean War. Pilot Samuel Massenburg was another ordinary 307th Airman who rose to extraordinary accomplishment in war and peace. Bombcom's ops analysts and planners came up with one more set of adaptations to deal with whatever the Soviets would come up with next. This latest innovation was based on a 1952 staff study that determined it was feasible to use 4 SHORAN arcs at the same time, with 2 aircraft approaching the same target on opposing arcs at separate altitudes. For strikes on airfields and large marshalling yards, the attacking force would no longer approach on one SHORAN arc. Instead, all B-29s would use 4 IP-to-target approaches, All 8 SHORAN ground stations would transmit signals so each flight of B-29s could drop bombs simultaneously. There is considerable spread to an airfield or marshalling yard target, especially a 6,000-foot runway for a MiG-15. So the 307th for its next mission would minimize its interval by bombing in pairs, with lateral separation between flights of 12 bombers on the same approach. Soviet night fighters, searchlights, flak, and ground intercept controllers would have to deal with a horizontal and vertical spread of B-29s from multiple directions that would be over the target for just 1 minute, rather than a single stream taking up to half an hour for all aircraft to drop bombs. Here's how one of the 307th's pilots recalled the technique in his oral history recorded in 2004.
We reworked our flight plan in such a way that we could put airplanes across the target 3 at a time. We would fly 3 different arcs, and we would fly 500 feet apart laterally and 15 seconds apart horizontally, front to nose to tail. That way, in a minute, you could put 3, 6, 9, you could put 12 airplanes over the target in 1 minute. So your exposure was very brief as far as the total flight was concerned, and as a result, we didn't lose any more airplanes the rest of the time I was in Korea.
The 307th marked its 500th mission, 21-22 January 1953. Wing Commander Colonel Russell personally gave a word of encouragement to the crew that drew the 85,000th pound of bombs to be dropped on North Korea by the 307th since August 1950. A week later, the Soviets again asserted an inflated claim of shooting down a 307th B-29 on the night of 30-31 January. But the fact of the matter was that aircraft number 44-27262 was hit that night, and some crewmen were injured, but the aircraft crash-landed at a U.S. airfield in South Korea. It was repaired and returned to combat duty. Late in January 1953, Far Eastern Air Force's intelligence noted an ominous development. 100 new Ilyushin-28 Beagle jet bombers were deployed in Manchuria and began showing up at Uiju. The twin-engine IL-28 was unlike any aircraft in the U.S. fleet at the time. It could carry a 2-ton bomb load and had a top speed of 400 knots. It was fully night attack capable to a combat radius of 690 miles. In December of the previous year, the Soviets sent up 2 IL-28s on their side of the Yellow River in broad daylight, flying parallel to U.S. F-86 Sabre jets flying patrol on the Korean side of the river. Joining the growing communist fleet in Manchuria of 950 MiG-15s and over 400 other combat aircraft, the IL-28 created a serious offensive threat to United Nations command. Intelligence watched the communists develop their own bombardment tactics, techniques, and procedures, and realized that U.S. airfields in South Korea would now be vulnerable to communist bombing. The Red Air Forces could now mount a serious risk of securing air superiority in the entire theater.
The Ilyushin IL-28 was designed and built in late 1947, making its first flight in July 1948. A twin-engine jet bomber, the design requirement was for an aircraft that could carry 3,000 kilos of bombs at 800 kilometers an hour. It was powered by an unlicensed-built version of the Rolls-Royce Nene engine, a 1940s British centrifugal compressor turbojet, the most powerful aero engine of its era. You may ask why a British-designed engine from a company as famous as Rolls-Royce ended up on Soviet aircraft. The answer is that we sold some of them to them. This may seem incredible today, and indeed at the time raised a few eyebrows, and was certainly a terrible mistake made in the early part of the Cold War. A relatively small aircraft, the Ilyushin IL-28 has a crew of 3, a pilot, navigator/bombardier, and tail gunner, sitting in their own pressurized compartments. The bomb sight initially used was based on the famous World War II US Norden bomb sight. Large-scale Soviet production of the Il-28 began in May 1949 with an improved engine, the Klimov VK-1, replacing the RD-45, the knocked-off Rolls-Royce Nene, giving improved performance. From 1950, the Il-28 was the Soviet standard tactical bomber.
North Korean Il-28s remained at Uiju Airfield for nearly 70 years. In this Google Earth image from August 2019, there are 27 Il-28 bombers on the ramp at Uiju Airfield. 5 more are parked in revetments along the main runway. Also seen here are 6 MiG-21s. Later imagery beginning October 2021 shows these aircraft removed and displaced with metal frame buildings. Transshipment cargo containers began to appear, eventually spreading across both runways. It seems Uiju Airfield became an import, quarantine, and processing area for freight coming from China across the Sinuiju bridges as part of North Korea's self-imposed, outsized isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Operations in February, March, and April changed pace to about 11 to 12 missions per month while training tempo increased. The 307th's targets continued to be supply dumps, troop concentrations, and/or processing plants. The Communists shifted their logistics concepts to more numerous but smaller facilities, all hidden inside town structures. By the end of April, BombCom strikes destroyed 132 of 168 such assigned military targets. And the 307th also incessantly continued to fly close support missions for ground troops in contact. In fact, just about every one of the 307's more than 500 missions included at least one and usually 2 close support sorties. This post-strike photograph shows a communist troop area at Ulgok after the 307's mission on March 24th. The heavy broken line shows the outline of the target before the B-29s attacked. The dotted line shows the desired area of bomb impact to achieve maximum destruction of the installation. And the unbroken line, closely following the dotted line, shows the area where the bombs actually hit. The small X marks indicate buildings destroyed. AP is the aiming point, and MPI is mean point of impact. BombCom photo intelligence analysts spent painstaking hours assessing each mission whenever post-strike photography provided such clear imagery. The 307th continued to excel operationally. They had the highest average CEP among all 3 bombardment wings, achieving an unheard of 0 CEP on 2 successive missions, 20 and 23 March. Its in-commission rate continued to top BombCom statistics, reaching 76% in March. BombCom Commander General O.P. Wayland visited the 307th in March and sat in on a debriefing session. Meanwhile, Captain Robert Lawson described his mission to the general as other members of his crew continued with their intelligence interrogation. Far Eastern Air Forces and BombCom analysts began developing one more new concept of bombing operations that would step up pressure on the communists to come around to an agreement at Panmunjom. Meanwhile, the major moves in the Korean conflict at this time were at the political level. And then Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin died on March 5th, and that changed everything. Stalin's immediate successor, Georgy Malenkov, spoke at Stalin's funeral of settling international disputes peacefully on the basis of mutual agreement between the countries concerned, launching the Soviet Union on a path that he described as, quote, prolonged coexistence and peaceful competition between socialist and capitalist nations, end quote. In December 1952, the League of Red Cross Societies had proposed an exchange of sick and wounded prisoners in advance of an armistice, while the incoming Eisenhower administration had warned the communists that America's patience was running out. In February 1952, the JCS instructed General Clark to propose just such a transaction, and it turned out the communists were eager to accept.
The Freedom Village at Panmunjom opens its gates in welcome to United Nations troops returning from prison camps behind red lines. First to be released are the sick and wounded. Now come men of the British and Commonwealth forces. The the pain and suffering they have endured are forgotten as they join their friends and allies in freedom. Each day when the ambulances arrive at Panmunjom come new stories of life behind barbed wire, of the heartaches, the loneliness, and of the suffering, for many claim to have been ill-treated while in communist hands. South Koreans particularly tell of beatings and torture and starvation. The spirit of the South Korean troops has not been broken. One tough little soldier carries a sign written in his own blood which reads, "The communists didn't win." Many of the returning prisoners do not realize how ill they are, but their weary, haggard expressions tell the United Nations doctors that the road to full recovery will not be short.
Operation Little Switch went smoothly, and truce negotiations began anew on April 26th. General Clark told the Joint Chiefs on the 1st of May that Far Eastern Air Forces would step up its air campaign to add pressure to the Communists to convince them that the United Nations would continue the military pressure until an honorable armistice is obtained. No 307th Airmen were among those repatriated in Little Switch. During the renewed armistice negotiations, the main issue blocking a ceasefire continued to be that of repatriating prisoners of war. The Chinese-North Korean delegation stubbornly refused to accept the notion of letting the POWs themselves determine whether they wanted to remain in South Korea or be returned against their will to their communist oppressors. Early in May 1953, 5th Air Force fighter bombers conducted the first strikes on dams in vicinity of Pyongyang. These strikes seem to have had devastating effect, with torrents of water flushing away railroad embankments, track and highways, and inundating fields of rice. But after this first strike on the Toksan irrigation dam succeeded, North Korean engineers simply lowered the water levels to try to render the effect of the bombs insufficient to produce a breach. So the 307th's mission to strike the Kuwanga Dam on 21-22 May delivered at least 5 direct hits with 2,000-pound bombs fused for deep penetration. But the lowered water level worked in favor of the enemy. There was not enough hydraulic pressure on the weakened structure to produce a break. They did have to drain the dam to effect repairs, leaving no water for irrigating the emerging rice crop for several weeks. In April 1953, BOMCOM Commander Brigadier General Fisher decided to initiate annual general inspections for each of its wings after the fashion of Strategic Air Command. Those inspections were completed in May. The mess hall had consistently failed regular inspections and did likewise in the annual general inspection. Final assessment reported there had been, quote, no apparent efforts to change from previously reported unsatisfactory supervision, end quote. Commanders attributed deficiencies largely to weak leadership among the local hires, over 1,000 of them, an issue out of their ability to influence. The new barracks continued to show the effects of poor construction and were now overcrowded, with 260 men in buildings designed for 180. And the persistently late arrival of replacements from the States resulted in too many men waiting to rotate out with too much free time on their hands, getting into the typical troubles of idle soldiers across the ages. Good leadership in the 307th kept disciplinary problems to a manageable level. These issues were not unique to the 307th, and things turned around quickly when Kadena military authorities placed all local villages off limits and imposed nightly bed checks. The results of the 307th's FEAF general inspection in May were typical. Each bombardment wing was rated overall satisfactory, with only a few minor, quickly correctable deficiencies typical of units in combat, such as lack of detail in written SOPs and excess parts on hand. Inspectors also found insufficient training time was given to daylight formation flying and visual bombing methods, but wing commanders and General Fisher himself pointed out that to do so would be a waste of time under present combat conditions in which no such operations had been conducted for over a year, and none were going to happen before the achievement of an armistice. General Fisher wrote in a personal letter to SAC Commander General LeMay that the SAC-style general inspections showed, quote, no items of concern or importance, end quote. With the apparent success of Little Switch and the increased pressure from airstrikes, the Communist delegation began to hint at concessions that would lead to an armistice. Direct talks had reconvened on April 26th, and U.S. military negotiators probed for any flexibility they might elicit from the Chinese and Korean representatives. Though hopeful, the U.S. side was not yet fully persuaded of the enemy's intentions, and the South Korean ally, led by President Ri, began to rumble with discontent at the notion of an armistice that did not include reunification of the peninsula, under his control, of course. As the political and military negotiators on both sides engaged in their mental parries and thrusts, BOMCOM and Far Eastern Air Forces grew concerned with the likelihood of a rapid and massive move of communist air power into North Korea before the military balance would presumably be frozen when the signature dried on the truce document. The situation would be perilously in question if the Reds were to establish a balance of military forces that would freeze the ground situation at a stalemate, but enable them to achieve air superiority. So FEAF planned a final operation for June to neutralize all communist airfields in North Korea. Commanders also recognized that they were entering a period of transition in anticipation of imminent cessation of hostilities. Not knowing how or how long the endgame would go, leadership was concerned to sustain the motivation to fight until the last shot was fired. No one wanted to drag on the fighting, but no one wanted to lose more airmen to the temptation to relax attention to detail so vital to safe and effective combat flying. BOMCOM held a commanders' conference in June announcing a series of initiatives. They would start an information program to dispel the notion of an immediate return to the United States. The Communists were still bent on world domination, and American strategic air power would be the front line of defense to prevent that from happening. All three bombardment wings would remain deployed as part of the Far Eastern Air Force's forward positioning to remain vigilant if the Cold War were to turn hot. Temporary duty would convert to permanent change of station. Rest and recuperation leaves were terminated. Commanders were to anticipate and prevent any drop in morale and watch for subversive activity among airmen. The mission would change from destruction to deterrence, and B-29 units would become fully proficient at Strategic Air Command emergency war plans. They would also develop contingency plans and be prepared to evacuate Okinawa or redeploy to another base anywhere in the world if directed. Each unit would return to a full-time flying training program and begin to develop those plans for immediate implementation once the truce was signed. All this was to be accomplished even as combat operations intensified to keep the Communists on course to the settlement that now seemed achievable. For ordinary airmen, the current war remained the preeminent risk to their lives. BOMCOM planned for the 307th to strike one more supply area on 2-3 June. But before the mission launched, all B-29s were diverted to ground support missions to deal with one more surprise Chinese offensive. This time the Communists attempted to push their lines farther south to occupy key high ground in the Iron Triangle. In October and November of 1952, when the armistice talks had broken down, UN forces had attempted to push their lines forward to seize the more defensible high ground in the Iron Triangle. That effort had not succeeded, and Chinese forces retained the dominant position on the northern apex of the triangle. Now, in June 1953, the Communists tried to return the favor, attacking to seize the southern 2 points from UN forces. The 307th's missions for the first week of June lifted and shifted to close support, employing the MPQ-2 ground control method to support the U.S. 10th Corps and ROK 2nd Corps defending Anchor Hill and surrounding high ground. The MPQ detachments, bomber crews, and ground units by now had forged a highly effective team in bringing B-29 fires down on enemy troops at night, since they had begun using the technique in April 1951. Now, in the summer of 1953, ground patrols covering the bombed-out enemy positions found hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies in and around the bomb craters. U.S. 10th Corps reported, quote, prisoners of war that we are taking are really complaining of night bombing. We think the night effort we have been receiving has done a great deal to discourage the enemy, end quote. The full fury of 12-ship missions now concentrated their death and destruction from above on the enemy's ground troops who were trying to seize a cheap win of dominant terrain feature before a ceasefire would codify the American forces' occupation of that hilltop. Chinese and North Korean forces relentlessly assaulted UN positions. The 307th's finely honed close support proficiency was called into action on 3 nights in the first 2 weeks of June. Each of these nights, 20 aircraft from the 307th had been tasked to bomb supply centers and dams. But on the 3rd of June, at virtually the last moment, 10 aircraft were diverted to MPQ-2 missions to support intense emergency frontline activity. On the other 2 nights, all 20 307th B-29s on the mission provided close support, executing a total of 84 sorties. With such last-minute mission flexibility from the B-29s, hundreds of tons of bombs made a critical contribution to UN forces holding their ground, despite significant losses. Enemy losses were estimated at over 6,600. Though the fight was in a sector covered by a South Korean corps, U.S. forces were not spared the sting of this battle. The 3rd Infantry Division held Outpost Harry, a hilltop defended by a company-sized force with a commanding position for calling in artillery fire. The vicious fight required almost daily relief in place of the unit, including at one point employment of the Greek Army's Spartan Battalion. The combined effect of soldiers' valorous defense and B-29 close air support cost the enemy over 4,200 dead in this company-sized sector alone. The action produced 5 U.S. Distinguished Unit Awards to infantry companies, including one for Greek Company P of the Spartan Battalion, and it resulted in the award of the Medal of Honor to Sergeant Ola L. Mize. Not all of the 307th's B-29s were diverted to the Iron Triangle battle on the night of 3-4 June. The other 10 bombers proceeded to their assigned target, the irrigation dam at Kusong. The intent was to inundate nearby Taechon Airfield. Back in May, Far Eastern Air Forces had successfully breached the Toksan Dam, flooding the adjacent rice fields. But when the 307th struck on the Kusong River Dam, the North Koreans were once again able to lower the water level in time to prevent a breach. It would be BOMCOM's last attempt at dam busting. Expecting the truce to be signed by the end of the month, BOMCOM returned to the maximum effort strikes on North Korean airfields in the last 2 weeks of June. The 307th once again flew into the heart of Mig Alley and struck Sinuiju and Taechon airfields on the night of 23-24 June. On the 20th of July, the 307th again diverted from the airfield destruction campaign to close support of ground troops. With yet one more innovative tactical adaptation, this time they employed SHORAN rather than MPQ-2 to drop their bombs precisely on specific pieces of key terrain along the Kumsong River just east of the Iron Triangle. This time their ground strikes were in support of the Republic of Korea's Second Corps that had been pushed off the demarcation line in a final Chinese effort to eliminate a salient that UN forces had thrust just ahead of adjacent U.S. Ninth Corps. The penultimate strike of the Korean War for the 307th was on Sinuiju Airfield on July 23rd. The wing turned it into a plowed field. The wing historian provided a fitting narrative of the 307th's final combat mission on the night of 26 July 1953.
There was no indication that this might be the last mission flown in the Korean War by the B-29 medium bomber. For the dozen crews of the 307th Bomb Wing who were scheduled for the 573rd mission flown by the wing against communist targets in North Korea, there was no hint that they would be making history in the pre-midnight bomb drop. It wasn't until the crews were on the hard stands, making their final inspections before takeoff, that the word flashed along the taxiways that the long-awaited truce might be signed in the morning, roughly 12 hours after they had unloaded their 10 tons of high explosives. Pre-flight inspections continued, even as the news flashed from hard stand to hard stand. The crews mounted their big U.S. Air Force Superforts, The engine started with a roar and settled to its steady drone. The cockpit checks were made. The planes, one by one, taxied from the hard stands to the warm-up ramp at the end of the runway. The tempo of the dull roar increased. They picked up speed. They were airborne. And still no other word. On course, the huge medium bombers, obsolete now but the famed workhorses of World War II, started their climb. It was 6 p.m., and in a few of the aircraft the radios were tuned to the Armed Forces radio station for the regular evening news. It was true. It could be signed in the morning, 20 hours later. The planes droned on, their engines powerfully pulling them higher and higher. The coast of Korea appeared and receded. The sun set and a brilliant moon appeared. Suddenly, the first departure from the normal course of a B-29 mission. Despite the full moon, glowing brilliantly in the night sky, it grew dark. The moon disappeared. It was an eclipse, a total eclipse. The eclipse passed. The aircraft crossed the battle line. It didn't look like a truce down there. Flashes of artillery were visible. The aircraft turned toward their target. It seemed something like a truce up there. No searchlights sent their probing fingers of light into the sky. Off in the far distance, a few faint puffs of black smoke appeared, but in the vicinity of the Okinawa-based aircraft, there was no flak. No communist fighters appeared. A towering thunderstorm of huge banks of clouds over the Yalu, far to the west, apparently prevented them from leaving their Manchurian sanctuary. Unopposed, the superforts droned on at bombing altitude. The target approached. The bomb bay doors opened. The bombs dropped. The bombers turned homeward. If the truce is a reality, the last B-29 bombing mission of the Korean War was completed.
With this mission, Samcham and Taechon airfields were as gone as Sinuiju and Uiju, and all 33 airfields in North Korea were now neutralized. It was the final bombing mission in the Korean War. Thus, the 307th Bombardment Wing, equipped with supposedly obsolete, outclassed, slow-flying, undergunned bombers, but manned by ordinary men of extraordinary ability, arose, flew, and fought each day for the duration of the Korean War. And the next day, they did it again. At war's end, the 307th's box score was striking. In 36 months of continuous combat operations, the 307th flew a total of 6,052 sorties, 96.7% of which were effective. They put 55,473 combat hours on their B-29s, losing 12 in battle and 12 more in accidents. Tragically, 153 airmen lost their lives or were missing at war's end. The last shot was fired on July 27, 1953, but the war was not yet over. Not until our prisoners of war came home. 34 POWs from the 307th were repatriated in Operation Big Switch between August 5th and September 10, 1953. Lieutenant Billy Fauché was pilot of the first B-29 to be shot down by a MiG-15 in the Korean War. He was the 10th man to be released by the North Koreans on the first day of Operation Big Switch on August 5, 1953. He was an immediate person of interest to the press. Ironically, he had been the most frequently photographed 307th Airman by Air Force Public Information before the fateful November 10, 1950 mission. And you can see those photos in episode 3 of this series. Collier's magazine correspondent Peter Kalischer scored a rare, exclusive one-on-one interview with Fauché in the press tent at Freedom Village. Fauché finally escaped his notoriety and enjoyed a milkshake as he began the lengthy process of intelligence interviews, both in Freedom Village and aboard the ships that brought the POWs back to the States. Major David McGee also returned to Freedom on day one and took his turn at the press table. He was radar operator on the 307th B-29 shot down on November 10, 1950. And Major McGee was all smiles during his medical exams. Major McGee's interviews during the return to the U.S. and afterwards showed he had a flair for the dramatic, both with his captors during his 33 months in captivity, much to the dismay of his communist captors, and in his return to the United States, to the delight of his comrades and the flight nurses attending to these ex-POWs on their airlift from Korea to Ichikawa Air Base, Japan. Lieutenant Samuel Massenburg, the rare black B-29 pilot in the U.S. Air Force of 1950, was released the next day. Massenburg was pilot of the last 307th B-29 to be shot down on January 11, 1953. He would return to flight duty and retire from the Air Force after 27 years of service. He went on to a distinguished career at NASA. All but one crewman of his B-29 were repatriated in Big Switch. It would be almost another month before the next 307th Airmen were released on September 1st. Airman First Class William Hansen is second from the right in this photograph. Hansen was a gunner on Lieutenant Massenburg's aircraft. Staff Sergeant Daniel Odawaga returned to freedom on September 5th. Odawaga was tail gunner on a B-29, shot down in the Big Raid on April 12, 1951. He had been taken into China for interrogation a few days after his capture, then marched to the brutal death camp known as the Caves. In this photo, he is on the far right, a few days after his transfer out of the Caves to Camp 12, the so-called Peace Camp. This photo shows a happier Staff Sergeant Odawaga on the right, alongside Airman First Class Leonard Moray, in a happier time at Freedom Village, enjoying their milkshakes as they admire the cigarette lighters presented to the repatriates by Freedom Village staff. Captain Robert Burke enjoys a cigar as he waits to be processed and interviewed at Freedom Village on September 8th. Burke was navigator for the 307th B-29 lost on November 10, 1950, the first B-29 downed by a MiG-15. A total of 6 crewmen of his aircraft would survive to be repatriated, including Philip Aronson, himself, James Edwards, Billy Fauché, and David McGee. Also on September 8th, 2 crewmen from the 307th B-29 shot down by flak on August 24, 1951, walked to their freedom. Colonel J.E. Blair, commander of the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, presents Staff Sergeant Glenn Brown with his commemorative cigarette lighter at Freedom Village on September 8th. In this photo, First Lieutenant William Wright, seated at the microphone, steadies himself to face the press. When the men were refreshed, medically checked, fed, and interviewed by the press, they were transported to Incheon Port, where they boarded U.S. transport ships such as this scene at the USS William M. Black for the long journey back to the United States. On board en route, they were extensively interviewed by military psychologists, intelligence, and criminal investigators. But the war was not yet over for one more group of ex-POWs whose return to the United States was delayed until 1954. Operation Glory took place during the month of September 1954. This was the mission to transfer the remains of those who had died in captivity and were buried in 10 cemeteries throughout North Korea. The Communists returned a total of 1,729 bodies. 45 of those men were from the 307th Bombardment Group. And for the family and loved ones of 26 airmen of the 307th Bombardment Wing, the Korean War is not over. These men remain missing in action to this day. They are not forgotten. The 307th Bombardment Group Association will not cease efforts until all are accounted for.
Was it always fair? But when freedom called, we answered, we were there.